Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're taking a look at the Patek Philippe 5712 in steel. As with all my reviews, let's go back in time now and take a look at the history of this watch. I'm just going to look very basically at the history, not too in depth. I've got other videos that are much more in depth looking at the 5712, but we're going to go back to the 1970s. Specifically 1976, when Patek Philippe released the Nautilus, which was a couple years after Audemars Piguet released the Royal Oak. Both Gel-Genta designed, both watches were aimed to combat the quartz crisis that was occurring in the late 60s, early 70s. Really, the intention was to try and make people aware of why it was worth spending the extra money on a mechanical watch as opposed to a quartz movement that was significantly cheaper and held lots of other advantages over mechanical movements. So yeah, it was part of a time where many watch brands, Swiss watchmaking houses, were really struggling and some were going out of business. So this was their attempt to try and bring back sales. And then skipping a few years on to 2006, which marked the 30th anniversary for the Nautilus for Patek Philippe, Patek celebrated by releasing a series of new watches in the Nautilus collection, totally revamped the collection. Couple major watches obviously being the 5711, but amongst the revamped pieces was the 5712, which is what we're looking at today. But the 5712 was actually kind of released a year before in 2005 in a different reference number, which was the 3712. The 3712 was a little bit different to the 5712. It had a slightly different case size and a slightly different dial, different bracelet. It had a few different changes that were then updated with the 5712 a year later, but it also had one of the shortest production runs of any watch from Patek Philippe ever. Literally only 1 year the 3712 was produced, from 2005 to 2006. So it's quite a rare watch, quite collectible now. But moving back to 5712, it was released in a couple different variations. Nowadays we have steel, rose gold and white gold variations in these watches, and for us the most popular is steel, which is what we're looking at today, second being the rose gold, third being the white gold. I love all of them for their own individual reasons, which I'll come on to later on. But that concludes our history of the 5712. Let's take a look now at the features. I'm going to start as always with the clasp. The clasp on this watch is the standard Nautilus bracelet clasp that we see on quite a few models. Some of them have been updated with a new style clasp where we don't have this fold over section anymore, but this one we still feature that fold over section. The fold over section allows the watch to be, or the bracelet to be a little bit more secure, adds that extra layer of security so that you don't accidentally ping the bracelet off, which obviously on a watch of this expense would be not such a good problem to have. So yeah, so that adds a little extra layer of security, which is good, and it's got a nice calatrava cross on it, laser etched or kind of etched out into the steel, which looks lovely. Very simple clasp. One thing that I wish they did change about this clasp though is that it is quite difficult to take off. You really have to pull the bracelet. I'd mentioned this on a 5711 review that I did the other day, that on a watch of this expense, it is very difficult to take it off, and it is sometimes scary to take that off on a concrete floor or outside or wherever. You have to be very careful because it literally is just done by yanking the bracelet. There's no, how Rolex has where you can get your fingernail underneath and lift the clasp up. There's not really the same for that with Patek Philippe. I would love to see them in the future introduce, same as Audemars Piguet has done with their bracelets, a twin trigger deployment system, which would add an additional layer of security and just allow it to be more controllable as you take that watch off. Clasp overall very comfortable, no adjustability though, and my only complaint is just that it would be a bit easier to take off. Moving on to our bracelet, we've got the standard Nautilus bracelet with the bubble links and in almost all brushed finish. The brush finish is not quite like Audemars Piguet's with the Royal Oak. It's quite a fine brush, almost like a satin finish, which is really nice. It does suit the watch really beautifully, and I love the details they put into the bracelet, all the different beveled edges, polished and brushed finishes as well. It's just a really lovely combination of all different parts of watchmaking and finishing and just handcrafted finesse, which is really beautiful to see. It's not my favorite bracelet though. I don't love the bubble links. I think they look a bit strange. They also really attract scratches as well. You really notice them on those bubble links as opposed to other bracelets from other brands. I think that's because obviously being bubbled, they protrude out from the actual bracelet flat edge, which means they are kind of the first line of scratching when you scratch that type of bracelet. But yeah, lovely watch overall, or lovely bracelet overall, sorry. Very comfortable too. As mentioned with the clasp, no adjustability though. I do love the way it tapers in from the case lugs into the clasp as well. I think that's really pretty. Moving on to our case now, we have an almost all brushed finish case, which is something that I absolutely love about the Nautiluses. The detail in the finishing is just stunning on Nautilus. It's really, really beautiful. Love the combination of brushed and polished beveled edges all over this case. Of course, I love the ears either side of this case, obviously reminiscent of a ship porthole as well, which is really cool. Original Gerald Genta design that he did back in the 1970s. Same design he also did for Audemars Piguet in some respects. All of them were inspired by a ship porthole, but this, in my opinion, is the most true to the ship porthole design. Seeing those hinges in the handle is a really cool thing. Yeah, it's very clever. And I love the symmetry that this watch offers as a result of those ears. We also have a clear crystal case back on this watch as well, which is beautiful because we get to see that stunning movement. And 5712s are one of my favorite watches when it comes to movements from Patek, because they're rotors, the little mini rotors, and they're really, really loud. And they spin beautifully and freely. But I love being able to hear the watch move and, winding with that rotor. So yeah, that's definitely one of my favorite things about this watch. Maybe is a weird thing. Moving on to the rest of the case, we've got a half brushed, half polished bezel on this watch, which fits in really nicely with the rest of the timepiece. It does scratch quite easily because of the grains. If you scratch anything against that grain or across that grain, it really does show up very clearly. But overall, really nice compact case, very thin, very elegant, very beautiful. Moving on to our dial now, we've got a blue dial with the interesting 5712 complications. I'm just going to break down the dial a little bit for you. So down the bottom left, or around around 7 o'clock, we have a date sub-dial with a small hand that sweeps around the dates along the edge of the sub-dial. And then on the inner side of this, we have a moon phase, which is really beautiful. Up at around 11 o'clock, we have a power reserve, which shows the power reserve for the watch, how much power is left in the coil or the mainspring. And then moving on to down towards 4 or 5 o'clock, we have small seconds. And then the two other hands in the center of the dial obviously show hours and minutes. So yeah, really simple dial when you break it down, but it does appear quite cluttered, or the complications do sprawl out over the dial rather than being kind of in more a closed off kind of area. They tend to just feel like they spread across the whole entire dial, which can look a little bit messy at first, and definitely it's not the most legible watch from Patek Philippe as a result of that. But when you look individually, they do all make sense. Personally, I much prefer the dial of the 5726. I much prefer the symmetry on that watch. I think it is a much more beautiful looking piece as a result of that symmetry. But I definitely can appreciate the dial and the complications on this 5712. One thing I wish they maybe did was, instead of having that date sub-dial with the hand and the dates all around the edge of the sub-dial, it'd be nice to see that moon phase kind of in the center of the dial down at 6 o'clock like the 5726. And perhaps instead of small seconds, we had a little date window, because really small seconds aren't particularly useful on a watch like this. The dial is a beautiful blue tone as well. It's kind of a sunburst effect where we have that gradient from the darker outside areas of the dial towards the center. It feels like it gets lighter, and also does shimmer in light as well, like a CD effect, like a laser etched effect. It does look very beautiful. And we have these ridges on the dial too, which looks really lovely. Catches the light, adds a kind of three-dimensional feel to the dial, and gives it a lot of life, which definitely on the white gold version it needs, because that dial definitely flattens away into the metal sometimes. Moving on to whether or not I would own this watch, I would definitely own this watch. I would probably own this steel variation as opposed to the rose gold or the white gold. I would maybe consider the rose gold, but for me this steel is just such a fantastic everyday wearer. The fact it's really nice and thin as well makes me in a way prefer this to something like the 5726, which even though I do prefer the dial and the complications that 26 has to offer, I much prefer the proportions on my wrist of the 12 as opposed to that depth that the 26 offers due to the increased complications. But yeah, the 5712, beautiful watch, sits stunningly on the wrist, wonderful proportions, love the low profile feel, love the complications it offers on the dial. The moon phase is just a lovely kind of little tippy top to that as well. Definitely that's one of my favorite complications in the whole watch industry is a moon phase. I think there's just something about it that looks so beautiful and balanced. And that concludes the review for the 5712. Let us know in the comments which one you prefer, the steel, the rose gold or the white gold 5712, or maybe you prefer a different Nautilus in the Patek Philippe collection. Let us know what other watches you'd like us to review. This particular example is available for sale with us at the moment. The listing for this watch is in our description below. And as always, if you're interested in this particular piece or any other watch in the Patek Philippe collection, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description and also at the end of the video. It'll be a pleasure to help you out however we can.